we're going to do a Q&A. I'm going to start with a question just to start it off, and then it'll be open to you guys if you have questions, and at the very end you'll have time to return to the exhibit and also come up to the speakers, because I know a lot of you want to. So, a question that I have for all the speakers, so feel free to start wherever, is I would like if you could reflect on your experience in Western institutions as an artist, curator, and or as a visitor. For example, how do you feel about a current exhibit that's at the Musée des Beaux-Arts right now?
I can speak to like a part of that question. I'm not going to speak about the exhibit at Musée des Beaux-Arts because I've been out of town basically since it's been up and I still haven't seen it. I think that all institutions, artistic or not, within this city, or at least the majority of them, we all know that they're run by white people. And I think my engagement with them is just about a management of expectations. I don't expect anything from these institutions because I know that at their core they're not meant to service me or represent me or help me in any way. And so I think that my practice has been about creating my own spaces outside of those institutions, and when strategically I need to draw resources from those institutions, I will strategize with other people to do so. But what happens in those spaces and the energy that is created, fostered in there, does not belong to me, and because I want to preserve my health, I just don't engage with it when unnecessary.
Thank you. So I have a lot to say about this question, especially with the current Picasso exhibition. So, where to begin? I'm sorry, I really don't know where to begin. There's so much. I think exhibitions like these perpetuate that cycle of all the problems that we have when we view Africa in Western spaces. So there's the problem of Africa being a black continent, the problem of Africa being primitive, this weird search for authenticity, as if all four of us sitting here in 2018 are not authentic Africans. There's the problem of North Africa not being part of Africa. I don't know what map people are looking at. There's like all these problems that are continuously perpetrated within these spaces. And I have a hard time with this because I am studying art history and this is a field that I want to work in. But when I look up at where I want to go, there's all these issues. And am I the one to solve everything? If not, how do I even work in spaces like these? And it's visiting exhibitions like this that really inspired Voiceless Utterance, because it's like we're voiceless, but we're speaking at the same time, but nobody's listening. There's all these ideas of erasure, misrepresentation, and one thing that I find really hard to grasp is just the fact that all these curators and all these big institutions turn to other Western folks to find their information about the rest of us. And does this make sense? Why don't we turn to Africans when we want to represent them? Because what happens, especially with the museum, if anyone in here works there, this is shade. But you really can't pat yourself on the back and say, look, we have an exhibition about Africans, when what you have, in fact, is some work that comes from Africa and a bunch of narratives and discourse that are Western. All you have to do is to speak to one African, like at the very least, And I think what these spaces do, because a lot of exhibitions go hand in hand with text, is that they take text from academics, scholars, writers, who again are outside of these spaces writing as experts. And this is why I have a few quotes that go with my work, with my series. And the quotes are from a Nigerian art historian who writes about Africa within a global perspective. And I find all these quotes really powerful because they justify what I've been feeling and they justify what I've been saying. So when I first read this article, my mind was blown. I was just like, wow, this is the most exciting thing in my academic career, because this is the first time that I heard an actual academic speaking about problems that me and Soukayna have been talking about for the past 3 years. And it's just feeling justified and knowing that all this work, that all this damage that I'm seeing in Western art institutions are real and worth feeling, and they're validated. So yeah, that's my answer.
I don't even know where to start, to be honest, with that question. It's pretty loaded. So I'm trying to sound eloquent and academic without wanting to sound too shady or aggressive. So I think that I agree with basically everything that Chelsy just mentioned about the whole institution kind of just taking a bunch of art from different countries in Africa and erasing, first of all, the western part and the northern part of the continent. And I think, how can I say this? When I went the first time, and I went to the pre-opening of the exhibition, and it's something that as a lot of Africans, especially as art historians, we don't see ourselves even in our courses or what we are taught or go in any institutions. And so when I first heard about that exhibition, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be amazing. This is this is something new, progressive. We're going to be will, for the first time of my life, be able to relate to something in a huge institution such as the Musée des Beaux-Arts. You would not believe my deception. So I think, first of all, it didn't really have any narrative, any contextualization about the artwork. It's pretty much, we're trying to be diverse and talk, and we are aware of our lack, but instead of doing research, we are just gonna plaster a bunch of different art in different rooms that do not correlate between each other. There's no curation done in the work, and not only that, but as you see, I think the person who was most quoted during that whole exhibit was Picasso itself. And how can you be critical about a painter and his artwork and everything that he stole from said continent and only quote him? And it didn't make any sense, right? Thank you. And it didn't make any sense. And not only that, but all of the other people who were quoted were non-Africans as well. You had W.E.B. Du Bois, you had Aimé Césaire, and you were just like, but where are the Africans? What are we saying? Where are we in here? This was not made for us at all. Most of art shows, exhibitions are not made for us. So I think this is where we have to take on the role. Although I personally hate it, I don't necessarily feel like it should be our responsibility to start that progress, basically, when we are the one outside of the position of power, where we are outside of the resources, outside of the accessibility, but for some reason it is our duty and job to kind of push through and make something out of nothing, which I find extremely unfair. And I understand that for a lot of people, this whole exhibition was a space of, as Chelsy mentioned, a lot of people were tapping themselves on the shoulders, but if you actually ask the people who are supposed to be shown and represented, we do not feel represented or visible at all in an exhibition like that. It kind of continues the whole colonial orientalistic mindset that the other is there, and also the term primitive and what is authentic. Authenticity is not a term, in my opinion, that should still be relevant today in those kind of exhibitions. It's kind of leaving, it's a nostalgic past that a lot of Western scholars and academics and curators and art institutions love to work on. And this romanticization of the past is a huge problem in trying to go further and progress in the art world. And so there is I can't swear. There's a lot to say about that exhibition, but that's just one of the things that I feel about it.
Okay, so just a heads up, I'm getting a little bit tired, so I'm not going to be as my social battery is very small. But one thing, so for the exhibition, I can't say much about that. I did check it out, and I was on a date, so I didn't really spend that much time looking at the work. It was a good date, though. I mean, nothing came out of it, but it was a good date. But I did feel overwhelmed by the entire exhibition, the amount of people there, just like the way it's arranged, like you guys said, it didn't feel curated. I just felt overwhelmed, and it was this opportunity to have Black art, African artists in this institution, and I just left feeling confused. I left feeling really confused, and I think both of you have really spoken about the issues with that exhibition really well, so I don't think I have anything more to add to that. In terms of my relationship with these kinds of institutions, I was just thinking about that. So I spoke a little bit about the exhibition I was in at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. It was a great experience, but again, the premise of going in and responding to a permanent art collection that isn't diverse already kind of limits the way in which you can interact with the work and the kind of pieces that you can create, or even just the premise was a little bit off. And then in terms of my other experiences, I kind of spoke about, and I always worry about this afterwards, if there's a transcript, if I'm throwing shade,
It's okay.
yeah. Anyways, but the other one, I have the same issue with all women art exhibitions, right? So I've been in 2 so far, and the first one left a really bad taste in my mouth. It was just not a good experience. And I participated in a second one, and it was a little bit better, but again, the premise of it, that just because we're all women, we all speak the same language, or our works will correlate. And I think it's the same thing when you think about how white institutions approach Black art or African art. There's an assumption that because we're all Black, then obviously all the works are going to work together, right? Because we're all African, all the works are going to work together. It doesn't work that way. And that presentation that Thelma Golden gave at the Musée MAC? Exactly, yeah. It really touched on how Black art isn't monolith. Within Black art, even in terms of my own practice, there's so much variation, right? So to think that you can curate an exhibition with just Black artists and that the works will automatically speak to each other doesn't make sense. And I think that's what a lot of these institutions end up doing. And it's a little bit lazy, right? And I think you need to do a little more research into the works, right? Because each artist is approaching these different themes in different ways. I always struggle with the idea of Black art and being a Black artist, and in the same way that my art has evolved quite a bit, my relationship to the title or the description of being a Black artist has evolved as well. Initially, when I was 19, I was really into W.B. Du Bois and what he was saying in terms of all Black art should be propaganda, art is political, and I was all about that. We have to represent Black people in this positive light, etc., etc. And now I kind of just in 10 years, maybe I'll be doing abstract art with there's no message other than I'm a Black artist, automatically that work is what it is. It will speak to that identity. So when we automatically think of Black art in this kind of limited and restrained way, and this is what Thelma spoke about, you end up just lumping things together, right? So I've seen that, and I've had discussions with people in Toronto, and they've talked about the same thing. And Toronto, I think, is a little bit different because there's a critical mass of Black curators, for example, and they, I think, are actually really taking up space, and they are organizing, and they are doing it themselves. And I think that is really interesting, and you can tell the difference.
we're gonna open it up to everyone for questions. I just, based on everything that you've said, I feel like that touched on something that we were saying earlier on, like, instead of trying to change a master narrative, there is way more generative energy that can be invested in developing your own narrative and seeing who engages with it in turn. Yeah.
Yes, Sarah. Do you want to? Super far, but.
Hello. Do you want me to get up or what? No, you can hear me? Hi. Hello. Hey, so I have a question for nènè, my girl. How would you explain archiving as being able to change the art's perspective or nature? Like in terms with, for example, the Picasso exhibition. If Picasso, for example, was always taking the space of a Black artist, how would you feel like that has actually shifted? Like for you, for example, when you archive your work, how are you making sure that it's actually being portrayed in the right ways once you will be doing retrospectives on them later on?
Thank you for that question, because I actually have to write something about archiving for another exhibit this week, so you're giving me really good pathways to think of. Okay, I think this is very interesting because the way that I understand archiving is perhaps different from like a Western academic sense. I think something is automatically lost when something that is embodied is transcribed onto paper. I mean, once when I was like at a reading group meeting and Joanna was there actually, Rachel was talking about how Black bodies have traditionally entered the Western archive. And usually it's been through violence. So we entered the archive when we were wounded, when we stole away, or when we were murdered. And those were the first accounts of us existing, even if they happened at the end of our existence. So already that questions the validity of such a system, if that's the only way that it's capable of accounting for our existence. I think that and I'm not the only person who thinks this at all, but I think that our bodies are the richest archives, and that there are several things that are embodied experiences that cannot be transcribed in other ways. So for me, it's more about embodying and experiencing the present moment with people and letting them take away what they will and trying to make my intentions pure when I hold space with other people. I will never be able to control how someone remembers or experiences something, but I can control my own experience of it, and I can control my intentions. And I think that the question that arises is, if we are so focused on how we are going to be remembered, are we living in the present and engaging with our present creations? And like, what is most important? What is happening in your lived experience right now, or how people are engaging with your life after your death? And I think that in Western culture, there's a lot of like fetishization of like things that are meant to be immortal. There's a lot of desire to like label people as geniuses, to say that their work is larger than life, etc. But all of those things eclipse the meaning of life itself. So for me, when I'm archiving, I'm trying to just see how something sits in my body. Like if it's made me smile, if it's made me laugh, if it's made me cry, if it's made me feel closer to somebody, and then I'm carrying that with me and seeing how I can translate that into my future experiences. But I'm not so concerned as to how that's going to be read in text, because I'm used to, as a Black person and Afro-descendant person, and the majority of things that I read about myself are false. So that's not what I choose to engage with.
Have a question?
Oh, like anybody else can answer if they have any,
Nènè's answer was
Yeah,
I can't.
Someone else has questions. Someone else have a question? You can ask about anything. Ask us questions.
Okay, well, you guys think I should ask a question? So think on it, because you should ask them questions. But you each talk about it in different ways, but just, I guess, talking a little bit more to how
how do you talk about African art, and what does that term African art mean? Because I know it can be misused, used unintentionally in the wrong way, or just misunderstood by people who don't even know that they're misusing it. So maybe just if you each had something to say about that.
Thank you. So personally, I do not enjoy the use of the term African art. This is because, again, I'm an art historian and I have never once heard someone say European art or North American art. So why then do we, again, put Africa into this monolith and think the term African art can really speak to all of the art from Africa? So I prefer to use art from Africa as a term because this includes all 54 nations of the continent and all the different cultures of the continent. I think art from Africa really implies that Africa is this big place. It can be summed up into this small piece of land, which I think that's the way we're used to talking about it. But with my residency, I'm also finding that a lot of Africans are using the term African art. And perhaps because it's so much easier to say African art than it is to say art from Africa. But I think that there's a difference when an African person is saying African art versus when a non-African is saying it. I can't necessarily tell what is implied based on who's using it, but again, I know that as Africans, we understand just how big, enormous, and just how variant our continent is, and I want to say we celebrate that, and at the same time, we're not working to erase ourselves like I think a lot of Western institutions are. And when I say erase, again, coming back to art history, when we learn about African art in art history, we look at ancient Egypt. But also we look at ancient Egypt in the context that is not part of Africa, because lo and behold, North Africa is not Africa, right? This is a joke for anybody who doesn't get it. And then from ancient Egypt, emphasis on the word ancient, we move to the Kingdom of Benin, which is not actually the country Benin, but a part of Nigeria. So instead of looking at the entirety of Nigeria, we're looking at this one place within the country. And from there, if the professor has time, like extra 2 minutes, we move to Congo. And when we're in Congo, we talk about mini statuettes, we talk about fetishes, and all this primitive art. And these are things that are being taught today in 2018 in art history courses. And it's off-putting, because this is how we view Africa, ancient in the past, not existing in today. So then when we use the term African art, I really find that we were keeping the continent in the past. We're looking at the continent as a primitive place that was discovered, because again, Africans didn't exist before they were discovered by colonizers, that's the word I was looking for. So with art from Africa, I'm really positing Africa today, in this moment, right now, living in the same existence as every white, Western, American, European, male artist. Yeah.
So I'm going to take a bit of a different take on that question of what that description of African art is, and it's kind of interesting. So with this panel, it's the first time I've been identified as an African artist. No, but it's a good thing, but it made me realize I've never called myself that. It's not, maybe now I can self-identify, but I don't necessarily self-identify as an African artist. I always say I'm Nigerian Canadian. I say I'm Nigerian, but I've never called myself an African artist. I call myself a Black artist. And again, I said that there's some things where I question that at times, or the emphasis on it. But yeah, it was the first time I was identified as an African artist. And I was talking to my dad about it, and I was like, yeah, I've never had this happen. And it made me think, what does that mean? So coming from Nigeria to Canada at the age of 5, I feel, and this is something that's interesting, when you ask someone like, what was that moment where you realized that you were Black, right? And for me, I don't have any memories from Nigeria, but I do have memories of when I realized I was Black, right? So my identity here and now has always been associated with Blackness, and especially as it relates to African American identity. Not to say that that's right or wrong, but that's how I've always seen myself. I've always identified with that kind of like, it's a subsuming kind of identity that just overtakes everything else, because regardless of where you're from, you're going to be treated as a Black person, right? So it overtakes everything else. And I think it is overpowering at times, because then I don't even ask, what does it mean to be a Nigerian artist? What does it mean to be an African artist? These are things I don't ask because I'm so busy being a Black artist, right? So just to say that this is something I'm thinking about, and like something, yeah, it's the first time I'm actually really exploring, like, am I an African artist? Like, what does that mean? Like, it's still a question for me.
Can I speak to it?
Yeah, for sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Just a response to Kosi's answer, which I think is completely valid and implies the idea that there's not one kind of way to be an African artist, in the same way that there's not one kind of way to be an African person. Because again, Africa is not a country, we're not all the same. We're so different. We're not all Black, you know. We're not all we're not all from the same country. We don't all have the same experiences. And at the same time, this is the first event that I have seen in Montreal that is for African artists. And I'm so happy to create an event like this, because so far I've only spoken or been represented in Black spaces, which is great because I'm Black, but it doesn't end there. I am Black, I am African, I am Cameroonian, I am American, I am Chelsy. Like, there's all these different dimensions of me that I think are worth exploring. But again, we're continuously put in all these spaces that choose what part of our identity they want to explore, but also bank off. So I'm not really surprised that, you know, nobody here has called you an African artist before. And it also makes me think of the idea of authenticity, where if you say now that you're an African artist, people can easily come up to you and say, oh, but your work isn't African. What is African work? Again, the idea of primitivism, just exotic, going to the past and being like, to be an African, for instance, your work needs to be tribal. You need to employ African masks. But no, we're living here now, today, with everyone else. And it's so important for all of us as Africans and non-Africans to realize that that term should not be limiting.
I guess this is in response to what you both said, because it was also the first time that anyone ever referred to me as an African artist. And when you invited me to be part of the panel, I was like, oh my God, like there's a Q&A, are people gonna ask for receipts? Like, am I African enough, etc. And I feel like my African identity has always been, I don't know, I don't want to say a point of tension for me, but maybe that is the right word. Growing up in a predominantly white context, and I went to like a white lycée for the first few years of my life, I was exposed to just like blatant racism, and it was clear that African was not the thing to be around these types of white people, and that they would place Blackness in like different forms of palatability. And I had the option to lean on my Haitian heritage and to just like completely, truly, like in the first maybe 6 to 8 years of my life, I completely omitted the fact that I was African. I completely dismissed the fact that like my father is Malian. I would get people to refer to me by my second name, because when I started preschool, the kids made a song about my African name and they would throw things at me. And they were like, go eat a banana or like whatever. And so I was like, I wasn't old enough to understand fully what it entailed, but I understood that like what I was experiencing wasn't just anti-Blackness, it was a true anti-African sentiment. And I internalized that for several years of my life, and I think that a lot of my personal growth happened through my connection with my father, my learning to embrace my Malian identity, learning to embrace my name, why it was given to me, why I was given my grandmother's name, what family legacies my parents hoped that I would experience and that I would pass through. And feeling kind of like I robbed myself of that for so many years just because people who are never going to care about me said things to me or did things to me, and that I let them have such an impact on me. But then you calling me an African artist showed me that I still had work to do to get to a place where I fully embraced my identity and felt like I had the right to claim, like, I don't know, I spent so much time with my dad, like, I grew up listening to, like, all of his music, like, almost every day we'd watch, like, Magic System videos, like, on the VCR, like, you know what it's like, you know? But at the same time, I always felt like my Africanness was my secret. And that secret could only be shared, like, with my other very close Black and Afro-descendant friends, and that it was something that needed to be muted in other spaces. But I think that through my practice, I've been able to, like, put it, like, so cheesy, because I said that I muted it, but, like, I was able to pump up the volume on it. Wow, I discussed myself. But yeah, like, through my practice, I'm able to be, like, African with other people and develop interpersonal connections that I couldn't in earlier stages of my personal journey.
I just, to kind of like bounce back on what you both said, actually, because I think my reality is very far different as well, because whereas you both didn't really thought or about describing yourself or identifying yourself as African artists, or maybe struggled with the fact of being African simply. I feel like on the other hand, I had to struggle to make my place and make myself heard as an African. Mm-hmm. I knew that I was, but I felt like a lot of the places around me, at all of the institutions, the kind of like circles, and every time there was like an African event, I felt like I wasn't invited there because people were so, they're like this very, very problematic thinking of way that all of the continent of Africa is Black, but it's not. And there's so many different like cultures and so many different identities, and a lot of people don't even know that actually in North Africa, the indigenous people there are actually named Imaziren and not Berber. And there's so many layers to it that I had to learn by myself because I felt out of place in those spaces, or I had people denying my African identity because I wasn't dark enough. And I was like, this is kind of ridiculous. Like, if you look at a map, Morocco is in North Africa. It's called North Africa. There's Africa in North Africa. Like, it doesn't... And so that's why I'm like, I find it interesting to hear both of your experiences with that, because I completely had the opposite, where I had to fight for people to understand and accept that title as for myself, because this is who I am. I grew up listening to Magic System videos as well. I still do. And it's just my experiences and are still valid and are still very important and are still part of a certain African narrative. I just wanted to share that because, yeah.
Okay, so we're actually going to end the Q&A because we're running out of time, but we do have time to still enjoy the exhibit and to come talk to the speakers directly if they have the time. But there are still some snacks and drinks at the back, and please take a look around the gallery. There's also going to be a vernissage here at the VAV on Thursday, August 2nd, so if you want to come back, enjoy the works. Chelsy will be here for her work, so you can come ask her more questions. I don't know what that was. But yes, thank you so much for coming, and please engage with the artworks and speak to the speakers if you have any other questions. Thank you. Yes.